Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General. Before we get started, I just want to go a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, it will be made available on the Mass General website, Blum Center page at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that you are in listen-only mode. Everyone has music and hear our guest speakers today. Today's session will be a little bit different. Rather than the usual Q&A portion at the end of the session, we're going to have an interactive, engaging session today where you'll be asked to participate and enter comments in the chat. So feel free to enter them in the chat. Only Blum Center staff and guest speakers will see your comments. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to help us complete. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. Okay, so next I am going to hand it over to our spiritual care team who will lead today's session.
Hi, welcome everyone. We're just going to pull up our slides.
Right. Awesome. Welcome everybody. I'll start with introductions. My name is Mary Claire O'Brien Wilson. I am a chaplain in pediatrics here at Mass General Hospital. And a little bit about me, I root myself in the traditions of both Roman Catholicism and Episcopalianism.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Ethan. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I'm also one of the chaplains here at MGH. I work primarily on general medicine floors. Yeah, thank you for being with us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine McCula. I'm an unaffiliated staff chaplain here at MGH, and I'm primarily on our medical ICU and our general medicine floors.
And hello, my name is Erica Long. I am a chaplain here as well. I work primarily in inpatient psychiatry and neurology, and I am a Unitarian Universalist minister. To open our session today, we wanted to acknowledge that a lot of us are grieving. We are actively grieving at this time, both us as your panelists and you who have joined us today. And so we thought it would be helpful to open with a centering practice. One of my favorite spiritual practices is song. I love to sing. And so I have this song to share with you today. I invite you just to take a couple deep breaths to ground yourself in this moment. And if you would like to join in singing, you are welcome to do so. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in that love. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in that love.
Thanks, Erica. Just want to offer a brief roadmap for our time together today. We're going to be talking about grief. We're going to be talking about some ways to understand and embody the feelings that come up for us in grief. We'll explore multiple models of grief, and then we'll share stories of grief that's present in our lives at the moment. And as Amy said, because this is a webinar, we won't be able to have group discussions, but we will have small opportunities for you to share about your experience or what you might be feeling. And we invite you to do that as it feels right and good to you. So what do we mean when we talk about grief? So many things. We know that grief is something that everyone experiences, And we're going to talk a little bit right now about 3 ways that we might understand grief. Significant loss is the first one, and it's probably the one that comes up or comes to mind first for us when we think about grief. It might be loss of a parent, a partner, a sibling, a child, maybe a pet. A big loss. And then another kind of grief is everyday loss, everyday grief. And I was thinking about some examples of that. What came to mind for me is maybe tension we're experiencing with a friend or with a colleague or a family member that's stirring up some grief. Or maybe when we experience a change in our daily routine that's causing some disconnect or not feeling right or good to us in that moment. And then the last category here is disenfranchised grief. This grief often comes along with the question, do I have the right to feel this way? We may be anticipating a loss coming in the future. We might have feelings that aren't happening on an expected timeline, either our own timeline or timeline that's been established by our community or society at large. Or maybe grief is surfacing about something or someone that's not in our day-to-day world, something that's happening across the world, or to someone we've never met before. All of these types of grief are normal. And I'll turn here too to the spiritual implications of grief, of these different kinds of grief. One way to understand spirituality is the connection that we have with ourselves, with the people around us, and with that which is bigger than us. And of course, we may or may not have a religious lens that sort of fleshes out that understanding more and more. It's really about how we make meaning in our world and in our lives. And grief often disconnects us from those things. It disconnects us from ourselves, from the people around us, from that which is bigger than us. And this can make meaning making difficult, sometimes even not possible, or we don't have access to that. So that's sort of the paradigm we're going to sit in today together. And this is our first opportunity to use the chat to hear from you if you'd like to share. I welcome you to write down what you might be grieving today. If you think of grief as a suitcase or a piece of luggage that you carry around with you, sometimes it's heavy, sometimes it's light, sometimes it's cumbersome and hard to hold in our arms, sometimes it's tiny. What luggage is with you today, and how does it feel in your hands?
You can go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll read a couple out loud to share.
Loss of my husband in May. Overwhelming sense of sadness due to the loss of my sister and my best friend. Thank you for sharing.
Loss of dreams that feel familiar and heavy.
Grieving a breakup, tough to grasp onto, slips through my fingers whenever I try to hold it.
Missing my grandson as the family moved away 5 years ago.
I lost my sister in April. So I'm really feeling both of those losses in my life.
Someone sharing about the deaths of Palestinian children in Gaza, feeling grief for them.
It feels like it will never get better. Even 1 year later, can't move forward. Already, it's really clear that we're each carrying a lot of luggage together. Almost everyone in my circle thinks I'm too attached to my grandson, but it's not. I love him.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I think Mary Claire is going to share with us about this.
Hi, everyone. Just holding all the grief that we're holding, I want to offer this model or this image of grief that just gives us a chance to kind of place what we're feeling in something that feels like it could be all sorts of things at different times. So this just offers us that there are many different ways to experience grief. And we might be in a phase of our grief where we're, stuck in the waterfall of tears and creating a mountain of tissues next to us, or we're just stuck in some fog banks of we don't know what the future holds. I like some of these images where on the outside of the heart you have an I don't care at all. There are moments where we just have to say, like, it's too overwhelming. I can't care about this right now. I can't hold it all. And then we also find that there's pockets of peace. There's people that we find refuge in, or moments. Just wanted to offer this as kind of a roadmap of that there really isn't one trajectory. You could find yourself in all different parts of this map at very different points. I'll pass it off to Ethan to explain more about models of grief.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Mary Claire, for sharing that wonderful image of the cartography of grief, or Grief Island. I think what that image does a wonderful job of expressing in a really colorful way is sort of the diversity of grief, the way that our day-to-day experience of grief can take so many different forms. Sometimes we're tearful, sometimes we're peaceful, sometimes we're numb, we're out there on, I don't care at all. I think that's so real and so relatable through that image. So with that illustration in mind, I'd just like to talk about some theories of grief and how those theories can potentially be helpful to us as we try to understand and navigate our own experience of grieving. So we've got a slide up here, and I try to capture this idea that grief has many facets with an image of stained glass. It's got these different dimensions: emotional, physical, social, spiritual, behavioral. And I think for each person, they're probably going to manifest in different ways. Just as we are all unique individuals, our experience of grieving will probably always be a little bit different from someone else's. And one point I'd just like to emphasize is that in processing our grief and responding to it, we don't necessarily do it in a linear way. Like Mary Claire was saying, we might bounce all over the island. And grief does not necessarily have a set timetable for how it will affect us. For some people, it might be a month. For some people, it might be years. These are all sort of normal, valid experiences of grief. We go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So we've got here is some reactions to grief from grief researcher William Warden. And again, this sort of captures the complexity, the nuance of the grieving process, all these different reactions and sub-reactions. So even just under the feelings category, feelings we have in response to grief, there's sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, loneliness. So there's so much that's only in the feelings category, but then there's also physical sensations like tightness in the chest, lack of energy. There's behavioral struggles. We might have a tough time getting out of bed. We might have a tough time getting to bed. All of these are sort of different facets of the grieving process. And, I think what this sort of illustrates, and what Grief Island sort of illustrates, is that grief is not just one thing or another. It's sort of the totality of our responses to loss. And our process of grief and dealing with it is not necessarily linear. It's not like, running a 5K race where we just sort of get to go forward and make progress and then it's over. Rather, it might look like wandering. It might look like backwards and forwards. And if your grieving process is linear, if it's a straight path from sadness to healing and hope, that's great. That's a valid and real experiences of grief. But it's also okay if your grief is not like that. If it looks very different and maybe feels messy or more confusing. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So just another note on William Worden. The way he sort of conceptualizes the grieving process is through 4 tasks, and those are in the nice acronym TEAR. T is to accept the new reality. E is to experience the pain of the loss. A is to adjust to the new environment. And R is to reinvest in the new reality. And these 4 tasks, you don't necessarily move from one to the other in a neat way. Sometimes you go backwards and forwards. Sometimes we might be working on more than one of them simultaneously. And these 4 tasks, obviously no model is perfect and speaks to every person's experience, but I think they're potentially a really helpful way for understanding what we're going through and how to sort of try to process and cope. So obviously, the first task, it comes to us in various forms, talking about the loss, maybe a funeral or memorial service, and it's just coping with our altered reality that comes with having a major loss or even a minor one. Task 2, experiencing the pain of the loss. This is largely about expressing the many emotions that are going to come with grief and loss, be those sadness, anger, despair, hopelessness, and sort of the opposite of this would be denying our feelings or avoiding them. So expressing those feelings and really looking at them head on, sharing them can be very difficult and it can take a long time, but it is definitely part of the grieving process that is positive, that is constructive. And sometimes society can be very uncomfortable with grief or stigmatize it or not want to make space for the reality of our emotional experience. But that just sort of emphasizes the importance of finding a safe space to let down some of our feelings and maybe share them with others. Task 3, adjusting to the new environment, is complex, but it basically means when our reality is transformed by loss, we have to sort of reacclimate. We have to not just emotionally and spiritually adjust, but we need to potentially learn new skills, learn to do household chores that the other person may have done. So that's a very practical task of grief. And then the final task, reinvesting in the new reality. Again, has different facets, but the way Worden describes it is emotionally relocating a relationship with the deceased and moving on with life, or that is to say, maintaining an emotional connection with our loved one while also making space in our lives for investing our emotions in other relationships, in forward-oriented activities. Can I get the next slide? Thank you so much. So this is just one more theory or model of grief. This is from Strobe and Schutten. It's called the dual process model. Basically, you've got in their conception 2 different categories of activity responding to grief. Those are loss-oriented activities and restoration-oriented activities. And all of those are normal. All of those fall within everyday life experience. And as you can see, there's sort of a jagged line bouncing back and forth between the 2 types of activities. So under the loss-oriented, you might have grief work, writing about a deceased loved one, or talking about our feelings with someone we love and trust, reflecting, going through their possessions. And then on the restoration-oriented side of things, we might have sort of starting a new hobby or meeting new people, different forms of self-care, and yeah, just exploring new sides of ourselves with our new selves and our new life that are shaped by the experience of the loss. And I appreciate that this model um, shows us that grieving isn't necessarily just a straight line forward. It's back and forth. It's oscillating is the word that Strobe and Schutt use, and I like that. I think oscillating is sort of a nice fancy word for bouncing back and forth and um, having good days and bad days. Sometimes we're going to feel stuck. Sometimes we're going to feel hopeless. I think one thing about Strobe and Schutt model that I really appreciate is they emphasize like both the loss oriented and the grief and the restoration oriented activities are stressful in their own way. None of this is easy. It can all be painful. It can feel overwhelming at times. And I think recognizing that it's important to, yeah, make time sometimes to distract ourselves, um, to not to take time to care for ourselves when we are feeling overloaded with grief. And even those days where we just need to not think about something are part of the healing process, the process of moving forward in a healthy way. So under restoration oriented, you can see distraction from grief and denial of avoidance of grief is in fact a normal, healthy part of the process that is mixed in with all the others, including, facing the really big emotions that come with a loss. So do the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll just touch on this one very briefly. It sort of speaks for itself, but I really love this image. It says people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time. What really happens is that we grow around our grief. So as you can see, that sort of that marble, that ball of grief is there, and it's the same size in every image, but in time, hopefully, our lives, our sense of self, our spiritual experience expands and grows, and the grief is still there. The loss is still there, but by engaging in those sort of loss-oriented and restoration-oriented activities, we can see that other parts of our lives are expanding and growing, and we can integrate our grief and those painful emotions into our new selves. Next slide, please. Great. So as we close this section of the presentation, I just want to offer up a quick poll. I'm really curious, did one of those images or models of grief speak to you? So we've got cartography of grief, the jar growing around the grief, the dual process model of going between restoration and loss-oriented activities, the 4 tasks of grief, or then a different model or image. I'm just wondering if any of those resonate with your personal experience of grief and grieving.
Give it a few more seconds for people to respond to the poll.
Great. Yeah. Thank you everyone um, for your votes there. I see we've got a spread. Um, and it looks like the most popular is the jar growing around the grief. Yeah, I really love that one too. It's simple, but it's really beautiful. So thanks everyone for listening as I talk about some of those models and theories for grief. And now I'll pass it over to Mary Claire.
Yeah, so we're gonna thank you, Ethan, for all that helpful information. We're gonna move into more of a storytelling phase, hopefully bring some of these models into the realm of experience by us sharing some of our experiences of grief. And I'm gonna start us off by sharing about some anticipatory grief that's been really alive for me lately. I'll just share a little bit about my story. So just about a year and a half ago, my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He's 72, so it's a little young to have this diagnosis, and it was pretty early on in his experiences of this that we got this diagnosis, and he had been having symptoms and things that we had recognized, and his we had other family members who had experienced Alzheimer's, so it wasn't unfamiliar. And in some ways, getting this diagnosis was a sense of relief that we finally had a name to put to the experiences he was having. He felt relief in having this because then there's things we can do. We can support him in certain ways. We can find trials and medications. And so there was some relief, but as you can imagine, there was also a lot of grief in my family around this. And it's interesting because this grief isn't from a loss that has already happened. This is grief that we're anticipating the loss that is to come. What is this decline going to look like for my family? And how will we experience it together? And how will my dad go through this? And I had an interesting experience just recently, again, a year and a half after the diagnosis, where my grief just kind of hit me in an unexpected way. I was at a celebration for my friend who was getting ordained. And during that ceremony, I witnessed her joy and her experience with her parents, and especially with her dad during the service. And it brought me to think about my dad and my celebratory events, what milestones are coming up for me in my life. And will my dad be able to be there for them? If he is there, will he be able to experience them in the way that he can now, in a way that he will be able to engage? And what will that look like? And wrapped up in this grief that I'm feeling is a lot of fear. I think those two emotions are going hand in hand for me right now. The fear of what won't be, like what experience will we not have? Fear of the grief that I'm going to experience. I know that it's going to only get harder from here in a lot of ways. And so I'm afraid of that wall of grief that might come at different points. Fear of whatever this might look like. And I think in anticipatory grief, a lot of it is hard to place because there's so much that is unknown and so much that is yet to be experienced. But then I think, what do I do with this grief? And sometimes I like to distance myself from it and say it's too hard to touch right now. We're not there yet. Right now we're having a lot of good days, and so we don't have to be there yet. But then in these moments where it just overcomes me, I find that when we were talking about spirituality earlier as connection to self and others, I find that really being in touch with my grief, connecting to it for myself, really allows me to be more present in my life. And I can be slightly more in control of my grief because I know it's there and I know why it's coming up. And then I can share it with others. I can share it with my family who is also experiencing similar grief, who understands it on one level, and then also share it with people around me to let them know this is what I'm going through, and this is why it feels so big. I'm feeling less alone and more connected. So, thank you all.
Thanks, Mary Claire. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about disenfranchised grief, which, as I said earlier, is the grief that often comes with the question of, is it valid for me to feel this way? Is it okay or right for me to feel this way? My nuclear family is in a season of shifting and evolving, which I guess we're kind of all always in those seasons, right? But this particular season feels poignant. I feel it more deeply. And I think that's because there's a lot of newness. There are new babies, there are new relationships, there are new traditions. And I felt this really deeply over the holidays. My family has always celebrated holidays together. We've always kind of gone back to where my parents live. And this was the first year that that didn't happen. My older siblings chose to celebrate in different ways this year, and it was so painful for me to navigate for a couple of different reasons. I think that the change, not having any control over it, felt really unsettling, made me feel a little helpless. And it was so confusing, that question of, is it right for me to feel this way? It was so confusing to hold or try to hold the joy and happiness and excitement over these new things, alongside my own feelings of sadness, of fear of being left behind, kind of uncertainty, wondering what this was going to look like in the future. It was it is very difficult for me to hold both of those things. And that's why I picked the image you see on your screen as this river that forks. And as I was looking at images like this online, I found one where, if you can imagine, the rivers keep going and they actually eventually come together again. But what I'm feeling right now, actually looks like a very calm river, but what I'm feeling right now is the turmoil of that fork. This river that's flowed together is splitting, and the split might not be forever. Those rivers are not actually that far from each other. They're just through the trees. And it's the same water, it's the same source, but they're different. And I have to imagine that underneath that still surface, there might be some swirling, some bumpy rocks or edges, or just some challenge that comes with any sort of splitting like that. And it feels like the work of this time for me, maybe not work, really, I guess the reality, holding both of those things, is trying not to disenfranchise my own feelings, whether that means having conversations with my loved ones about how I'm feeling, but more often than not, also having conversations with myself and letting myself sort of feel what I'm feeling, not try to explain it or sweep it anywhere or make it neat. Just let it be what is, kind of let that river continue moving, and hold that for myself. Thanks for letting me share.
So I picked this image of a bluebird because bluebirds were my grandmother's favorite bird, and she was always looking for them. And they're pretty rare, actually. It's pretty hard to see them. But she grew up on a farm just outside of Boston, and she would set up different bird houses and bird feeders to see if she could get bluebirds. And so these birds always remind me of her. And you might guess from the title of this slide that I am someone who's gone through a significant loss. And I would say that last April, my family gathered at my grandparents' farm on a warm day to celebrate my grandfather's 93rd birthday, which is pretty amazing. And I just remember it being the most perfect day. The weather was great. A lot of my family was together, my cousins, my partner, my mom, my aunt and uncle, and we walked around the farm. We spent time together in the house. We told stories. We just had a really simple, beautiful day. And 2 days after that, I received a call that my grandmother was in the hospital, that she had had a stroke, and she was 90 years old. It was a stroke that was not severe enough to end her life, but that significantly impacted her quality of life. She was no longer able to read or drive. And again, like I know that for a lot of people, you don't make it to 90 years old still driving and reading and hosting your family for birthday parties, but that was her life, and that's what gave her life meaning and joy. And she really tried. She went to rehab. She did physical therapy and occupational therapy. We had people come into the house, but it was very painful for her to not have the independence that she had had and to have to rely. My grandmother was someone who was very particular. So she cooked a particular way. She put the dishes away in a particular way. She was the best person at making a bed. And like she could make a bed better than anyone I know. And to not be able to do those things and have to rely on someone else to do them was a great loss for her. So in August, after struggling for months, she had a conversation with my grandfather where she told him that she wanted to go on hospice. And they've been married for almost 70 years. And they made the choice together that she would transition to hospice and she would pass at home. And we were able to spend time with her. I was able to be with her before she died. But there was so much of it that felt really surreal. She's just always been there. She's always been in my life. And she passed away on August 14th. And since then, I've sort of had a mix of emotions. As a chaplain, I know a lot about grief. I know a lot about our spiritual journeys. I know that part of life is that we lose these people who are so important to us. And it still feels surreal. Like I think that I like it sounds silly, but I think that she's still there all the time. And I've also had moments that my family members can't really relate to. Like I feel very sad and I miss her, but I also I go to visit my grandfather and we read her letters and we look at photo albums. And she was a pretty private person. She didn't like being the center of attention. So these are things that we never really could have done when she was alive. And so I also have these moments of just feeling connected to her where I can see pictures of her when she was my age, when I could see letters from her from when she worked as a nurse here at Mass General and tell stories. And I feel just so much gratitude. So it's really been like this mix of sadness and gratitude all together. I feel like my family has been forever changed. And I've been thinking a lot about how we are all grieving the same person, but our grief is so different. And what my mom is feeling and what I'm feeling, what my sister is feeling and my grandfather is feeling are unique to each of us. And I don't know, I'm still in like the really early days of it. It's been less than a year and I'm not really sure what it'll feel like tomorrow or next week or on her birthday or those things. So yeah, thank you all for listening.
What now? What now? We have to pick up the suitcase. Maybe we never put it down today. We'll return to that metaphor of carrying the things we carry around with us every day, including our grief. I'm curious to know the grief that you may have named either in the chat with our group or maybe just to yourself earlier. How does that feel right now? Does it feel the same as it did earlier in the afternoon? Is it heavy? Is it light? Did it slip your mind? Maybe you're remembering it's there again. Maybe you're feeling bad that it slipped your mind. Maybe it was a relief. We can use the chat one more time. Maybe feel free to share what's coming up for you right now. think it's also really important looking at this beautiful image on the right, to be gentle with yourself, be gentle with ourselves as we're sitting with grief, as we're doing our own sort of reflection or accompaniment. So maybe another good question to think about right now is, how might you be gentle with yourself today? I'm seeing that it feels like my jar is a little bigger.
Someone else shared, the suitcase is still there, but instead of feeling like I'm the only one with a suitcase, it's easier to recognize everyone has their own suitcase.
Mm. Someone's suitcase feels really heavy. As time passes, they cry less, but their heart aches whenever they think of their sister. Unlike what was said about new traditions, they feel like the old traditions are just not the same without their sister being there. They try to be happy, but they wander off and cry. I relate to that.
Someone shared, to accept the grief no matter what other people say, and hope and trust that two rivers will join again.
Well, it feels like everyone is tired of me crying. They almost get mad at me. Yeah, like it's too much somehow. Thank you everyone for sharing so vulnerably with each other, with yourself today. I'm going to turn it back to Erica for our closing.
Yeah. Oh, actually, first we've got this.
Oh, I forgot. As you can imagine, there's so much to talk about and think about, reflect on when we think about grief. We pulled from a number of different sources today, but there were so much more we could have and wanted to include. And so we thought we would take a moment to just put those things up here. Of course, a few of many. I welcome you to take a picture of this, maybe with your phone, if anything is jumping out at you. And as always, too, you can reach out to us at mghspiritualcare@mgb.org. We would be happy to share these resources with you, or be in touch in whatever way might be helpful. And now I will turn it over to Erica.
Thank you. All right, so just as we opened with a song, we thought it might be helpful to end with a song today. So this is a piece I love called Chico Gospel by a band named Muse. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. I've actually, never seen them in concert, but I hope to someday. So they make beautiful music. And this is a song that's helped me through a lot of different moments of grief in my life. We're just going to sing 2 verses. And I invite you to listen. I invite you to hold your grief in your heart and to hold it tenderly. And if you want to hum along or sing along, we can't hear you. It's just for you. So feel free to do it. Okay? All right. There was a time I believed life was over for me. There was a time I believed my life was over. I feel strong today, thanks to your help. I'll find my way, and I too will lend you a hand when you need one. Sometimes I get so down, I feel like this is the end. Like there's no way in hell I can get over this mountain. The sun has come beyond the shadow of my doubt. I am walking on this earth stronger than ever. There was a time I believed there'd be no love for me. There was a time I believed I'd get no loving. I feel love today, thanks to your help. I'll find my way, and I too will lend you a hand when you need one. Sometimes I get so down, I feel like this is the end. Like there's no way I can get over this mountain. The sun has come beyond the shadow of my doubt. I am walking on this earth stronger than ever. I am walking on this earth stronger than ever. I am walking on this earth stronger than ever. I want to thank you all for joining us today and for joining us in the reality that grief is a part of our life journey. It's a part of our spiritual journey. And while your grief is unique and my grief is unique, we are not grieving alone. We close today as we began with a reminder for kindness, for gentleness, and I just offer my deep appreciation for each of you for the vulnerability of being here, for honoring your grief, and for moving your own way through this very challenging part of the spiritual journey of our lives. Thank you.